Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Jessica Catalino. I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Women here at UCLA. On behalf of our director, Rachel Lee, I send her regrets. She'd hoped to be here today but was called out of town. So imagine Rachel's here. So welcome to Black Milk, Colonial Foodways and Intimate Imperialism, a talk by Diana Garvin. This is the final talk in our year-long series in the Center for the Study of Women called Dishing, a lecture series on food feminism and the way we eat. But before we get started, I want to make a few brief announcements on behalf of the center. CSW will be holding a symposium called Chemical Entanglements, Gender and Exposure on May 4th and 5th, so please save the date. This public symposium is going to gather a unique group of scientists, artists, writers, who will explore the gendered health outcomes of toxic exposure. We have been gearing up for this event all year and hope that you'll join us for what's sure to be an exciting exploration of feminist approaches to environmental justice, public health, and exposure-related illness. We're excited to be welcoming panelists that include artists like Jessie Cohen and Peggy Munson, biologists and toxicologists such as Andrea Gore and Tyrone Hayes, and activists from a range of organizations including Black Women for Wellness, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. And the full list of panelists is available at the registration table in the back. We're also thrilled as part of Chemical Entanglements to be welcoming the conference keynote speaker, environmental journalist Florence Williams, who was awarded the LA Times Book Award in 2012 for her book, Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History. She'll be speaking about her own experience having her body and breast milk tested for contaminants and the implication of her findings for women's health more broadly. This will be an engaging symposium, and you can pick up a flyer for it also at the registration table. Also at the registration table, which is my theme here, you can sign up to stay up to date on CSW events and opportunities. We are always searching for collaborations, partnerships with organizations, scholars, and students who want to be involved with and contribute to CSW. You might want to do it by blogging, volunteering, or donating. All is welcome. If you would like to get involved, please don't hesitate to speak to me or one of the CSW staff who are here tonight. All right. I'd also like to thank the generous co-sponsors of today's event. We have the Division of Social Sciences, the UCLA Healthy Campus Initiative, the Department of History, Food Studies Graduate Certificate Program, the Center for European and Russian Studies, the Iris Cantor UCLA Women's Health Center, and the Department of Italian. You can tell the range of entities that was interested in co-sponsoring speaks, I think, to the broad interdisciplinary appeal of this talk. A special thank you to the Charles E. Young Research Library, and in particular Diana King and Susie Lee for hosting us for this event. And also I want to say, since it's the last event in our Dishing series, a special thank you to the CSW staff, Alexandra, Christina, Melissa, and others who have been so wonderfully staffing these events all year. Please make sure to join us after the talk for a reception. We'll have light refreshments outside in the hallway. And now I'd like to finally welcome Diana Garvin. Diana holds a PhD in Italian Studies from Cornell University. Her dissertation, which was called Feeding Fascism, Tabletop Politics in Italy and Italian East Africa, 1922 to 1945, analyzes food as the physical evidence of power negotiations between individual women and the state in Italy and in former Italian East Africa, i.e. modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. She conducted research in over 25 museums and archives, mostly in Italy. And her work has been supported by all kinds of fellowships, the Elon Fellowship, an AAUW American Fellowship, the Julia Child Foundation Scholarship, and the AFS Sue Samuelson Award for Foodways Scholarship. Thanks to the support of CLI, our Mellon Fellowship, this year she spent the 2015-2016 academic year conducting research in Italy for a second project on colonial foodways and East African women's domestic work in Italian homesteads. Recently, Diana's had some exciting developments. She'll be returning to Italy in the coming academic year as she was awarded the prestigious Rome Prize by the American Academy in Rome. And upon her return, she will join the faculty at the University of Oregon as Assistant Professor of Italian. So congratulations. Please join me in welcoming Diana Garvin.
wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. So can everyone hear me in the back? Great, so just let me know if I start getting quiet. That's usually not a problem for me. So, you all, or at least most of you, should have a packet with some supplementary information for today's talk. This traces the provenance of the different images I'm going to show today. And if there aren't enough copies to go around, they're also available online, and I'm happy to email individuals with extra provenance sheets. So today I'll be speaking about everyday life under fascism in Africa and in Southern Europe, and why this period matters today. In the talk, I focus on colonial foodways. So the markets, goods, and people who travel between Southern Europe and East Africa to evoke broader questions of intertwined histories. I characterize the daily actions of feeding and eating as forms of intimate imperialism. The idea that colonialism is at its most powerful when it operates on the inside of markets, of homes, and in the case of food, even inside the body itself. And I argue that the racism and sexism that are inherent in fascist imperialism are embodied in spaces, objects, and daily habits. So my project is predicated on two assumptions. The material world persists, and daily habits repeat. As such, apparently apolitical spaces and places like food markets and ageless activities like breastfeeding are often the last areas to hold on to fascist period forms of inequality. But by understanding the history of these arenas, we can find new ways of reckoning with colonial memory without reinscribing fascist ideology. So today we're going to look at 3 case studies. First, I'll discuss colonial marketplaces in East Africa to show how architectural concepts like shifting site and gridded layout cast fascist concepts of racial hierarchy in stone and wood. Next, I'll show how commercial food culture and children's games carried these concepts across the Mediterranean, teaching Italian, French, and Spanish children how to act like colonists. Then we'll return to the market to examine the intimate domestic labor of interracial wet nursing and colonial breastfeeding photography. This section, which addresses the black milk of this talk's title, reveals how photographic interventions to anthropologize and eroticize breastfeeding continue to inform contemporary conceptions of gender and race in the Mediterranean. And to conclude, I'll apply these ideas to neo-fascist food movements and Islamophobia in Italy and France. Now, a quick word about my approach. As a white female historian, I cannot speak to the embodied experience of blackness. But what I can do is be a thoughtful historian and an empathetic ally. So I approach the full spectrum of Mediterranean identity with shine theory in mind. Coined by Aminata Sow and Anne Friedman, this practice involves repeating one another's stories, and in the case of this talk, one another's histories, to ensure that they are being heard, and crediting one another to prevent others from claiming the ideas as their own. Shine theory is essentially amplification as feminist practice. As Sow and Friedman put it, I don't shine if you don't shine. So national borders and boundaries are porous, fractious and fractionated, and above all, ever shifting. Because the Mediterranean connects North and East African and Southern European cultures, however uncomfortably, far more than it separates them, this study privileges people over nationality and follows their voices and stories as they cross and recross the waters. And now, let's go to the market. So in the context of colonialism, why do markets matter? They matter in 2 senses. As specific and concrete locations in empire, and as an abstract system that assigns value to goods. So we might think of these 2 markets as market with a capital M and market with a lowercase m. In terms of market with a lowercase m, the marketplaces of Addis Ababa, Harrar, Quórum, Asmara, and Mogadishu matter because of their diversity and their social activity. These sites were among the most vibrant social hubs of Italian Empire. The vast spectrum of skin tones made it difficult to define races, let alone to arrange them hierarchically. Commensality, the breaking of bread with old and new acquaintances as soon as food was bought or sold, further threatened these borders and boundaries. And the colonial marketplace as a physical site evokes the market with a capital M. Because of their enmeshment in international commerce, colonial marketplaces provided an ideal setting to hash out broader questions of racial value and worth. And today we're going to look at the market in three ways. As a theater for the construction of race through architecture and photography in East Africa in the 1930s, as a commercial mode for the dissemination of racism in advertising and photography in Europe from the 30s to today, and as a locus for confrontation and reckoning with the racial legacies of colonialism. So, fascist urban planning, the destruction of East African street plans and buildings, and the erection of Italian monuments and thoroughfares constituted a key plank supporting Benito Mussolini's imperial project. During the Italian occupation, the fascist regime undertook an ambitious restructuring of the city to give it a new face, a declarative sign of territorial appropriation. In November 1936, the Consulta Centrale per l'Edilizia e l'Urbanistica was created and began to participate in revising the plan. In keeping with discussions held the following year at the Istituto Nazionale di Urbanistica, the key to the plan was the clear separation of native and Italian quarters. In a word, segregation. Whereas European urban planning in North African cities like Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers tended to retain the area's historic infrastructure while inserting new Italian and French buildings, the Central Committee's plans for the East African hub of Addis Ababa treated the city as a blank slate. Emergent racial politics in Rome account for this shift since the site was by no means vacant. Addis was already an important market hub participating in the world economy by the turn of the century. It hosted a large international presence, both commercial and diplomatic. The market hosted a Saturday crowd of 30,000 to 50,000 people, offering imported goods from North America, Britain, and India, and attracting traders from across the Middle East. Indeed, the mix of populations and languages indicates that Addis Ababa, despite its poverty, was more cosmopolitan than Tripoli, or, for that matter, than any Italian city under Mussolini's domestic rule. Turning now to the Mercato Catema, we see how the regime used architectural interventions like shifting site and gridding layout to divide Ethiopians and Italians by skin tone, constructing race through commercial space. First, let's consider the regime's interventions to the site of the Mercato Catema by looking at the Central Committee's first plan for changes to the market. And at this point, I'd like to highlight the architectural history work of Harrar of the University of Addis Ababa, who's been a guiding light for this project and who's agreed to share his annotation with you today. This first step of the Italian plan pushed the market site off the highest hill of central Addis Ababa and into a lower hill in the northwestern exurbs. As a clear measure of urban segregation, the new European elite overtook the city's core, with the local population removed and kept in Addis's outer rings. This proto-banlieue separated the city's population in barriers of blue and green, tributaries of the Akaki River Basin, and swaths of the region's celebrated eucalyptus trees. The move divided the market in two, creating one market for Ethiopians and one for Italians. While the governor's technical office, alongside famous rationalist architects like Gio Ponti, used architecture to racially segregate vast zones of the city, the Mercato Catema move is the only case of a site-specific intervention to divide the population in terms of black and white. At the new site of the Mercato, the planners constructed race through segregation and through topography. By consolidating Ethiopian and Italian vendors and market goers at two separate sites, they grouped vast ranges of skin tones into two supposedly obvious groups. They then used the city's mountainous terrain to physically construct the fascist conception of racial hierarchy by moving the indigenous mercato into the shadow of the Italian market, effectively darkening the entire space. This overtaking of the market constituted a synecdoche for the fascist approach to urbanism in the city at large. For Mussolini, taking over the physical site of Emperor Menelik II's centralized power meant visibly absorbing it, controlling the apparatus that he had created, and then expanding it for his own purposes. In a process that bell hooks describes as eating the other, wherein one person assumes the powers of another by consuming her heart, the fascist regime would inherit the high structure of the Abyssinian dynasty by consuming the market, the heart of the empire, and then modifying it according to its own designs. So fascist interventions to the Mercato Catema show how the regime separated and intensified racial groups. Fascist interventions to the market layout show how the regime used architecture to then attach qualitative cultural values to these newly constructed racial categories. Flexible structure had marked the original marketplace. Social agreement, rather than architectural structure, organized the market. So what appeared chaotic to Italianize, in fact, bespoke years of careful negotiations between families of vendors. And this type of market arrangement was also common in Southern Europe at the time and stretched the coastline from Napoli to Nice. But in Addis, Italians quite literally squared the circle. They bypassed living architecture in favor of a permanent grid system, erecting wooden stalls in long rows in accordance with rationalist principles of science and geometry. Now, a brief counterargument. Viewing these photos one after the other, it might be tempting to read this new market plan in a positive light. This is modernization, not fascism. Where is the violence and control? And this is part of the broader Italiani brava gente, Italians the good guys narrative. The idea that compared to the French or Spanish, Italians were quote unquote the good colonizers, bringing food and jobs rather than hunger and forced labor. And this narrative stems from a historiographic problem. For years, historians of Italian colonialism tend to study only the major state archives, which contain government sources like this photograph. Early scholarship thus replicated fascist period narratives of the European civilizing process in Africa. And this is why contextualizing these images with material from small regional archives is so important, because they contain the countervailing information. First-hand accounts from female Italian colonists remark on the new European market's poor hygiene compared with the original market. Crossing disciplines helps to explain why this may be the case. African studies scholars such as Keston Gosh have noted how the new European plan decentralized the administration, giving each functionary control over one square of the market grid. So no one was in charge of the market's collective sanitary functions. Put very bluntly, the new plan eliminated the bathrooms. So what some have pointed to as the apparent modernity of the second Luce photograph is in fact very misleading. The market may have appeared more organized, but it was less hygienic, and these different qualities of cleanliness matter. In the Mercato Catema, permanent rows of stalls promised to improve circulation for buyers and goods. But they also arranged Ethiopian vendors so as to make them more identifiable and accessible to European tourists. The market became an anthropological study of racial types, displaying each tailor, spice vendor, and metal worker in labeled boxes of uniform size, creating a living diorama that conflated, often incorrectly, race and regional origin of the vendor with the goods that they sold. So by imposing the categories that it claimed only to describe, the grid physically pushed vendors to conform to their allotted slots, their literal lots in life. In an architectural rendition of the ecological fallacy, The false logic that an individual action, place, or person represents all actions, places, or persons belonging to the same group. The market metonymically figured both a continent and a skin tone. When government officials for Luce, the fascist film and photo arm, wanted to speak about Africa in any capacity, they used the mercato as a backdrop. Moreover, the regime also encouraged private citizens to engage in the same practice of photographing the market's quote-unquote characteristic elements. So in East Africa, Ethiopians were to use the market. In Southern Europe, Italians were to watch Ethiopians use the market through propaganda and advertising, and thus to understand themselves better. Frantz Fanon reminds us, colonialism hardly ever exploits the whole of a country. And here I paraphrase, instead, it extracts and exports its natural resources to the metropole, a mercantile process that enriches the few. But what of the many? The rest of the colony follows the path of underdevelopment and poverty. The regime's persistent focus on the marketplace provided the opportunity to show mercantile images of plenty, bulging bags of exotic fruit and stalls bursting with bright textiles. And these images falsely suggest that food in the colonies was plentiful. So, to sum up some of the key takeaways of section 1, and this is, by the way, the longest of the 3 sections, the power of architectural history is that it demonstrates how physical structures support mental constructions. Markets, including the mercato catena, may expand or contract, but they're rarely demolished. Their original fascist goals forgotten, these structures continue to perpetuate the original goals of the building's architects, segregating African and European populations. Photography also holds racism and sexism in place over time, in part because of tourism. Tourists tend to travel to places that they have already seen in photos. A goal of travel is to capture the exact same picture that originally inspired the trip, recreating the original subjects, poses, and angles to prove that they made the journey. And this is one way that colonial ideas replicate and disseminate far after the troops depart. To give just one example, Ethiopian men working as tailors were a popular subject for regime photography, showing feminized and diminished threatening masculinity. Photographs accentuated their diminished status by shooting from slightly above to make the men appear physically small. These 2 photos are nearly identical, but they were taken over 100 years apart. Now, I don't want to suggest the continued use of built environment and touristic photography are inherently bad practices. In fact, they can be used to promote positive movements like environmental sustainability and cultural preservation. But I do want to signal the importance of engaging with the lived history of these spaces and practices so as not to repeat their original purpose, which was to create segregation in public space and to assign value to skin color. Contemporary post-colonial photographers in Italy are talking back to these representations, suggesting creative ways that we might preserve colonial memory and reflect on the legacies of fascism without celebrating its far-right politics. In Rino Bianchi's 2013 photography series, Italo-Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Somali journalists, activists, and teachers pose in urban spaces associated with fascist imperialism, connecting East Africa's Italian period with its current legacy of migration and the multi-ethnic metropole. Here, community leader Zara Mohammed stands at the center of the Via Somalia. This project, called Roma Negata, Percorsi postcoloniali nella città, argues not for the demolition of these squares and byways, but for the reinscription of their colonial histories in the fabric of the city. For the addition of knowledge, not for the subtraction of debate. And along similar lines, many post-colonial authors are addressing the architectural legacies of colonialism in literature and oral history. And during the question period, I'm happy to speak further about some of these ideas. For the moment, I will simply say that this photographic project offers one way of beginning to think about the connections between past European settler colonialism in Africa and present forms of East African migration and diaspora in Southern Europe. A reckoning that takes place not in the Mercato Catena of Addis, but at the Stazione Termini, Rome's banal and buzzing heart. So moving back and forth across the Mediterranean and between the fascist period and the present day evokes the transnational nature of this area's common history. Markets thrive where there is movement, global flows of goods, trade, and value. I've already alluded to this idea with regards to photography and tourism, which brought images of East Africa to Southern Europe, anchoring new concepts of race in terms of mercantile value in continental Italy. And these ideas bring us to the second section of today's talk. Now, I want to delve into the specifics of how East African marketplace imagery traveled across the Mediterranean via private food companies, and how these images taught young Italians, French, and Spanish citizens to act like colonists through daily practices as apparently innocuous as collecting picture cards or eating a bowl of oatmeal. And these practices were, I argue, part of the racial construction of whiteness in Southern Europe. And their precepts continue to shape race and racism today. So scholars of food and migration, and I'm thinking of Jaida Sharma, Donna Gabacha, and Rebecca Earle among them, have identified a consistent pattern in transnational trade. Raw goods are produced in the global south and flow northward where they're consumed as finished products. But what happens when trade routes tangle? And more specifically, what happens when two fascisms meet? Luce provided their photos to private companies for free, which spread fascist ideas along food chains linking the Mediterranean coastlines. When cacao and chocolate traveled trade routes, they carried fascist photography and colonial narratives in their wake. So let's turn to a specific example, the collectible picture cards that came with a box of chocolates. Produced by the Manuel Oriroca company in Barcelona, this deck contained 20 cards. The front of each card showed an East African marketplace photo taken by Luce. And the back of each card told the story of Italian imperialism in Ethiopia in Spanish. Now let's consider how the image and text work together to create gendered narratives of power and subordination in the colonial world. The topic is by now a familiar one: tailors seated at sewing machines and the feminization of Ethiopian men. Emasculation emerges in the card's text as well as its photography. The back of the tailor's card reads, Huerto Menelik II siguió un periodo de indisciplina y su viuda, la emperatriz Taitu, que no veía con simpatía la regencia, aprovechándose de ello, sublevó la región del Tigre y se hizo proclamar emperadora. Empress Taitu Betul's infamy north of the Mediterranean stood in direct proportion to her astounding martial success. She led the Ethiopian Cannoneers Division against the Italians in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, resulting in the only major European defeat in Africa at that time. But perhaps most telling of her royal role is this personal detail. Emperor Menelik II often prevaricated, postponing difficult decisions by answering, Ishi, Nega, and tomorrow. Taitu closed these diplomatic incursions with the more decisive term, Ingi, absolutely not. As a result, Empress Taitu was increasingly unpopular, while Menelik remained beloved both among fellow royals in the court of Addis Ababa and among rival powers rising across southern Europe. Common fascist interests across Spain and Italy and inter-Mediterranean trade routes meant that private food companies served as a potent means to bring political messages of colonialism to a critical population, the future soldiers of the fascist empire, that is, to children. So how do you play with a picture card? Consider the back of this pro-fascist pamphlet produced and paid for by the Liebig Meat Extract Company. Oh, sorry, that is an empress. This is the image of Empress Taitu. Moving on. The back cover gives a sense of family interactions. and shows how these cards were actually used. Mothers purchased packaged bouillon cubes, and children collected box tops. 5 or 6 box tops earned a pack of cards. 10 or 12 box tops earned a Liebig album to display them. So let's turn to a Liebig deck. Once again, we see images of East African marketplaces. The first card in the deck is Mercato Catema, our focus of section 1. At a basic level, these cards acquaint petite potential colonists with their empire, giving them a sense of ownership while comfortably seated in the metropole. But, and I want to underscore this form of play amounts to mimicry. What fascist architects did in stone in the Mercato Catema in East Africa, European children did with paper in Italy and Spain. This is how children participated in colonialism, by placing people in little squares into designated grids, all held in place by international food corporations. And Liebig was not the only food company to turn military aggression into a game. Farina La Erba brought colonialism to breakfast. In this case, box tops from the children's breakfast porridge collected a board game that translated each step of Italian military aggression in East Africa as the roll of the dice. The game begins in the Eritrean port of Masala. 2 steamships dock at the ocean port, marking Italy's commercial entry to the region in the late 18th century. The disastrous Battle of Adwa, recall Taitu's troops, is marked by the Italian tricolore. Land here and you lose a turn. The object is to get to Addis Ababa and to claim the Ethiopian capital for Rome. European children could even eat their morning farina out of colonial-themed dishware. These tiny cups and plates show the camels, palm trees, and huts alongside the cannons, tanks, and guns used to take them. And this reduction in scale is key to the construction of children's racism. This is an empire that you can hold in the palm of your hand. Advertising reduces real violence to play. Akin to Ashima Bembe's observation of everyday life in Cameroon under French rule, what marked violence in the colony was, as it were, its miniaturization. It occurred in what might be called the details, and it could erupt at any time. Ginori, the ceramics maker, has created Fisher-Price weapons. Their hard lines are made circular, and all human evidence of violence is removed. The artillery is, for lack of a better term, cute, and therefore dangerously approachable. We barely notice that the tank is cracking a palm tree and that the cannon is still smoking. The Italian and Spanish fascist regimes were not the only Southern European powers to promote colonialism through food. In France, Pierre Laval's government sponsored the Exposition Coloniale Internationale. The 6-month event, held in the eastern outskirts of Paris in the Bois de Vincennes, provided a forum for the discussion of colonialism in general and the French colonies specifically. The Afrique Occidentale Française even sponsored a restaurant, one of the most popular attractions of the exhibition. And a cookbook emerged from the exercise. Catherine, the regular columnist of home recipes and housekeeping advice for the pot-au-feu, published La cuisine exotique chez soi. The exhibition cookbook included a section claiming to explore souvenirs gastronomiques de l'Afrique noire. Preposterous dishes like termite sandwiches and omelets made of crocodile eggs abound. The author mashes together European preparations, sandwiches and omelets, with African ingredients meant to provoke European shock and disgust. Little wonder then that many souvenir postcards from the colonial exhibition chose to flip the script, suggesting that European cuisine featured in the civilizing process in Africa. Here, Cupidal soldiers serve risotto and polenta against a background of tukul huts, each topped with the Italian tricolore. All of the soldiers, cooks, and tribal leaders here are represented as children, but while the Italians stand and appear to be of elementary school age, the East African children appear as toddlers, emphasizing the racist trope of Africans as infants and Europeans as adults in progress through the age of man. French postcards from the exhibition also draw on this trope, recasting white French girls as the keepers of black baby dolls. The same wording, souvenir de l'exposition coloniale, appears on another postcard which takes this racist idea to its logical extreme. The first postcard suggests that the souvenir is a postcard. The second suggests that the souvenir is an actual African child, who the European girl can play with like a doll. And postcards traveled, spreading these ideas well beyond Paris. You may have noticed that the first French postcard was posted to Germany. Racialized doll play has been part of American childhood as well, stretching, as Robin Bernstein has noted, from slavery to civil rights. So male-gendered play of empire reduces violence to a board game. Female-gendered play of empire reduces a person to a doll. It is, I would argue, actually more horrifying. Male play kills the person, female play denies that they were ever human to begin with. When interracial feeding shifts from girls' play to women's work, it takes on different meanings. Section 2 has shown how private food companies wrote and disseminated scripts for white colonial play. Board games rehearse military movements, dishware turns weapons to toys, and postcards turn people to dolls. In Section 3, we move from images of white toddlers feeding black baby dolls to the real domestic work of Ethiopian wet nurses feeding Italian infants, a clear example of intimate imperialism. White and black bodies physically touch through feeding and eating, and, as I will argue, this connection has biopolitical implications for fascist thinking. On April 5th, 1939, the racialist periodical La Difesa della Razza published recommendations for the proper nutrition of Italian infants born in the colonies. The guidelines condemned one feeding practice in particular, il bariatrico mercenario indigeno. Interracial wet nursing, or quote-unquote mercenary breastfeeding in the regime's parlance, was a common form of domestic labor in the colonies, a fact decried by Giuseppe Lucidi, the article's author. He cited dubious studies claiming to have analyzed African women's milk in comparison with that of European mothers, and found it too high in fat, that is, too rich for consumption by white children. And Lucidi went so far as to say that the native pathogens would render Ethiopian wet nurses' milk undigestible for white Italian infants. It was, he claimed, black milk. Fascist women's groups unleashed fleets of prophylactic pamphlets decrying interracial wet nursing as well. Fake science and fascist government intertwined and leapt towards literature. The opening car crash of Marinetti's famous futurist manifesto sends the protagonist flying from metallic vehicle to muddy earth, and from European adulthood to colonial infancy. So the question is why? Why devote so much panting press to interracial wet nursing? I contend that in a period that the fascist Italian press put so much effort into constructing racial difference, this particular form of domestic labor challenged the binary of black and white at a cellular level. Scholars of the colonial intimate, like Ann Stoler and Ann McClintock, have traditionally focused on the bodily contact of interracial sexuality. But I would argue that the physical intimacy and exchange of fluids involved in wet nursing and breastfeeding are critical to our understanding of race and gender in the colonial world. Feeding and eating transcended the gap between the self and the other, blurring the line between subject and object as food turned to tissue, muscle, and nerve, providing the energy that drives them all. So to parse the imperial intimacies of feeding and eating, let's examine two photos taken mere moments apart in a marketplace in Harrar, Ethiopia on May 8, 1936. So the first of these two photos shows shows an Ethiopian fruit vendor as she breastfeeds her child. And the camera work tells us how the photographer framed Ethiopian breastfeeding as anthropological, thus estranging what should have been a common global feature of motherhood. The mother's head and the background are both blurry, suggesting that the photo was taken in haste, without the subject's consent. It purports to capture breastfeeding as though it were an anthropological moment exhibiting characteristic or stereotypical Ethiopian culture. But the furtive nature of the photographer's approach also suggests a latent secondary motive, the erotics of Black breastfeeding. And indeed, a second version of this marketplace scene changes the tenor of the photo. Between shutter clicks 1 and 2, the photographer must have interacted with the photo's subjects. He seems to have made 2 requests, one to the mother alone, asking her to look up from her infant's face to face his camera's lens, and one to the crowd and to the mother, asking them all to smile. And the smile is particularly key, because it places this second photo in the Italian tradition of Black feminist photography. So how did the regime use these images? Whose hands would have held them, and how would they have understood their content? The fascist regime's Milizia Volontaria di Sicurezza Nazionale established and diffused the concept of the Venere Nera by turning these photos into postcards, which they distributed to young Italian males, potential soldiers, at barbershops in Italy during the first months of the Ethiopian campaign in 1936, and later to enlisted soldiers in Italian East Africa. Now, this fact was already a matter of historical record. But what's really interesting is what happened next. Italian soldiers wrote on these erotic postcards and mailed them home to their wives, mothers, and daughters in mainland Italy. In their text, they call the loved one's attention to the postcard's illustration, noting how the woman is a, quote, characteristic one. In other words, the soldiers who used these postcards often framed women in anthropological rather than erotic terms. They used the pretext of strangeness to excuse and obfuscate the potential for arousal. Anthropological pretexts for looking at erotically posed East African women framed race and ethnicity as unassailable differences, walls that separate the gazer and the object of the gaze. Tautological reasoning ruled soldiers' decisions whether or not to send a postcard depicting a topless woman to a female relative in Italy. If they sent the postcard, they declared it to be anthropological in the postcard text, because they would not send pornography to a female family member. If they kept it for themselves, it was pornographic, and they would use it as such. As a result of these 2 factors, the definition of pornography rested, oddly, on the use of ephemera rather than its content. So the second photo of the smiling Ethiopian fruit vendor may not have appeared sexual in isolation, but when read in relation with the vast iconography of calendars, postcards, and advertisements that eroticized East African women, the photographer's request to smile changes the tenor of the woman's slightly bare breast from maternal to erotic. While the British Army brought an end to the Italian Fascist regime's colonial projects in Italian East Africa in 1941, imperial constructions of race continued to reverberate. The anthropological and erotic framing of Ethiopian women diffused into a more generalized racism, hard to identify but still keenly felt. Companies continue to use race as an advertising gimmick, conflating sexualized, dark-skinned women with luxurious, dark-colored food products. Now, one might argue in Italian mass media that all women are sexualized. And while I would concede that point, I would also argue that mass media sexualizes Black and white women in different ways, largely due to the legacies of Italian colonialism. Advertisements for Black women overwhelmingly use the color of their skin as a visual pun to connote similarity to former colonial products, like chocolate or coffee. Further, the erotic portrayal of Black women continues to be tinged with the anthropological. Along those lines, Italian fascination with Black wet nursing resurfaces in this image, photographed by Loviero Toscani for the United Colors of Editing. Now, obviously this image is alarming, and it brings up a broader issue. How do we teach the history of gender and race without replicating harmful power structures? I typically use techniques drawn from feminist pedagogy. So students and I will discuss what inclusive debate of these issues might look like, and then we write a rubric together to guide our class discussions. Having these conversations, again, no matter how uncomfortable, is the first step towards compassionate discussion beyond campus. The Black Venus of this photograph is not only topless, but headless. We're meant to notice only two iconic elements, her bare black breast and the white infant that she feeds. So even in the modern era, interracial wet nursing exerts an outsized pull on the Italian imagination. This advertisement for United Colors of Benetton has won more awards than any other ad in the company's history. So clearly, Italian portrayals of both Black wet nursing and breastfeeding speak to larger issues of how race and racism are constructed and consumed. Eroticism and anthropology constitute two planks in the platform. But I believe that there's one more element to these images that's absolutely key. They are, ultimately, about how people, as well as products, figure in foodways. Although we rarely characterize breast milk as a food, or breastfeeding as a foodway, both bear consideration as public political activities. Because the food producer, the mother, and the consumer, the infant, physically connect in a mutual act of feeding and eating, breastfeeding provides a key to understanding all other foodways by clarifying their most basic essence, a one-to-one exchange of nutrients, fats, and vitamins between two human bodies. During the 1930s, the cooking magazine La Cucina Italiana provided recipes for nursing mothers that aimed to improve the flavor of their breast milk. The taste of the infant, not the mother, mattered. These recipes aimed to fortify the bodies of the nation's future soldiers. In the imperialism context, the fascist focus on East African wet nursing and breastfeeding points to a desire to eat the other. That is, to both erase and appropriate through aggressive consumption. As I mentioned in section 1, this theory from bell hooks helps to explain the fascist urban planning in the Mercato Catema. Here, it untangles luce breastfeeding photography in this rural marketplace in Harrar. And Hooks' theory underscores a fascist fear as well. Eating the other is step 1, but what happens next? Digestion doesn't mean disappearance, it means incorporation. So every meal presents a racial risk. If food remakes the body from the inside out, then an Italian infant that consumes East African milk can no longer be considered wholly Italian. Local food begins to reshape the foreign body that consumed it. This is how I would argue the second logical step of eating the other. With apologies to Salman Rushdie, the empire bites back. So, kind of bring all of these ideas together and into the present day context. Today, we see Mediterranean migration unfolding in reverse. Eritrean, Ethiopian, and Somali citizens navigate the dangerous and often deadly waters to seek employment and political asylum, bringing the foods and foodways from the Horn of Africa to Southern Europe. Neo-fascist parties, such as Lega Nord and Fiamma Tricolore, have framed these cultural shifts as an assault on Italian identity and nativist foodways. As one poster put it, sí a la polenta, no al couscous. Oh, Lega Nord. In January 2009, the Tuscan town of Lucca banned the establishment of new ethnic restaurants as a means to defend traditional Lucchese food and foodways. In words that echoed the rhetoric of Benito Mussolini, city council members defended this move by evoking an idealized national past, one that cast Italy as rural, religious, and racially homogenous, and above all, politically conservative. Thus began the so-called Kebab Wars, a modern-day incarnation of the Duce's alimentary battles for autarkic foods like grain, bread, and rice. Extreme right-wing groups began to adopt Luca's culinary conservatism as a cultural symbol of neo-fascist ideology. In France, kebab shop crackdowns emerged as a cause célèbre of far-right French blogs before resurfacing as a campaign issue in elections for European Parliament in 2014. Robert Ménard, a candidate for the mayor of the southern city of Béziers and a co-founder of the Boulevard Vautier website, lamented, quote, "Too many kebab shops are a threat to the historic image and identity of the city." Front National candidates such as Julien Sanchez of Beauclair and Michel Chassier have followed in Ménard's kebabophobia. Upon his election, Sanchez vowed that the police would now be sent to patrol kebab shops on a weekly basis to monitor for illegal activity. So in Lucca and in Béziers, and in other Italian and French towns with this new legislation, the ethnic label applied almost exclusively to Middle Eastern and African restaurants. By contrast, these townships welcomed Asian, American, and Western European cuisine, as evidenced by the plethora of new sushi spots and burger joints that have recently opened in these townships. So one could divide legal and forbidden restaurants on the basis of the cook's skin tone. Brown and black marked illicit cuisines. The inconsistent application of this law suggests the designation of a certain cuisine as ethnic is by no means stable across time and place. Despite the hysteria engendered by the Kebab Wars, Southern Italian food history suggests that Middle Eastern and African flavors and recipes have been part of quote-unquote traditional Italian cuisine since before Italy was a unified nation. Centuries of Arab influence in southern Italy marked regional cuisine so heavily that, to give but one example, the North African origins of Sicilian ingredients and preparations came to be considered local foodways, not important ones. Less than 100 years ago, the fascist regime pushed Italian consumers to embrace colonial foodstuffs like bananas and coffee beans, if not the Somali and Ethiopian preparations for these foods. Because food evokes national identity, it also lurches into nationalism. During a political rally in Cervia in central Italy in July 2013, a leg-ignored voter in the audience hurled a stalk of bananas at Minister of Integration Cecile Kyenge. Minister Kyenge responded on Twitter, decrying the divisiveness of the gesture's verbal substance, as well as its nutritional content, noting that it was a waste of food. She concluded with a challenge to us all, and I quote, "The courage and optimism to change institutions has got to come from the bottom up." So food matters. As the right-wing Lega Nord and Front National cases show, questions related to the purchasing, cooking, eating, and representing of food indicate social norms as well as personal choices. This talk has explored the politicization of the private sphere from the perspective of eating cultures, a food studies concept that focuses on the culture surrounding food. That is, I looked beyond food itself to consider the practices and representations of feeding in the broader context of Mediterranean politics. These cases are drawn from my dissertation, as well as new archival research and interviews conducted for my second project, which extends these themes into the present day. Food constitutes the point at which politics physically touch the individual through the material reality of everyday life. The physicality of food, along with its daily, universal nature, means that it provides a point of entry to investigate the history of people who didn't write it: women, the working class, and ethnic and racial minorities. They were, and are, the people doing the cooking.
Really hard not to make further food references, but I'm gonna resist. So we have about almost 20 minutes for question, answer, and discussion. Diana has graciously paved the way for some of the questions already, so let's begin.
So in the co-op, it showed a couple of photos of tables. Also, during the time that I spent in rural Africa, I often had to get things repaired, and there was no electricity. So there was what you're familiar with, the old sewing machines where you could just push on them and you could with your feet and use them anywhere. So when I went to get something repaired, and this was all up and down East Africa, I don't ever recall really the person who did that money job for me as feminine to speak to a man. So is that just a matter of interpretation to say the person is being feminist?
First of all, thank you for your question. And the issue of using the work of a tailor to feminize Ethiopian men is very specific to this particular time and place. Being a tailor was often a job that Italian immigrant men took on when they went to the United States. And in this time period, there was a lot of sensitivity around being seen as feminized in this new country because they were holding this job. So the feminization of the tailor is actually very unique to the 1930s. It was largely because of how Italians were feeling about their relatives being tailors in the American context. And they imported that feeling into these photos of East Africa. I like that you pointed out the emphasis on the sewing machine itself, because that is something that also loops into the greater patterns of trade that are in place at this time. The Singer Sewing Company imported a huge amount of these machines, again, during the 1930s. So you're right, and it's not that the gender play is not the only thing that's happening in these photos. Luce really wanted to emphasize that they were participating in these larger forms of trade, that they could be the ones as part of the European narrative, they could bring the technology, they could bring the civilization, when they very much felt themselves to be the beneficiaries of it.
Yeah, I was wondering, because West African markets are typically mainly female, but my own work in Mozambique showed that a lot of the market vendors are actually men in different contexts. So I was just wondering in Addis and other Mogadishu what the breakdown is of male and female vendors. Now they have really female space or not?
It was highly varied. So I looked at, and of course I'm trying to read multiple sources at the same time. So it's the vast majority of the photos that I'm looking at are collected by the fascist regime. So the information in those needs to be triangulated because they will over-photograph certain scenes. So it's difficult to judge the exact breakdown from those. It seems to be hyper-local. The Harrar market had one system where Women would sell certain types of goods, but men would sell different types. Men were in charge of the livestock, women were in charge of fruit, as you saw in that photo. But then in Addis, it appeared to be almost exclusively male, with women, well, actually, no, let me rephrase that. Women occupied the edges of the original market space. So, thus far from what I've seen, each market was different.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very rich talk. Thank you. Just a couple of points that may make it even richer. One thing that you might want to mention, I don't think you did, is that Italy was the first country to make segregation a matter of legal decision. So they actually mandated segregation before any other colonial power, which is kind of interesting. The other thing is that, I mean, I thought your argument about breastfeeding was very interesting, but you could also see as important the fact that interracial breastfeeding was occurring at all. And that the reason why there was all this far-right propaganda against breastfeeding was that, in fact, in spite of the segregation laws, breastfeeding was happening. And the final point is about couscous, and you touched on that a little bit, but couscous is a traditional Sicilian food of the western side of Sicily. So the polemic, more polenta, less couscous, is indirectly also against Sicily.
Yeah. Oh, and you know what, let me actually build on that, because that is a key point that, that I would have loved to have brought out more in the talk. Key to the racial construction of black and white, as Lucia Ray has just pointed out, is the fact that Italy occupied, in this particular period, a very strange liminal space, where they are so engaged in constructing themselves as white because they had been considered, quote unquote, the blacks of Europe. They are the south of the north and the north of the south. So they are hyper engaged in this project, being seated in this exact zone where they are trying to construct all of these ideas in the fascist hierarchy. That explains part of the intensity and engagement in this project.
And there's a common saying, south of Rome is Africa.
And it's a very it's been used with Spain, it's been used with Italy, so it's very typical of 1930s Texas.
I had a question on the market. You talked about the relocation of the market in Addis Ababa, and I was wondering if the fascist regime did something similar to markets in Italy, in southern Italy, since they did a lot of relocation and architectural works, so that could have happened in Italy as well. And the way you were describing the market reminded me of many markets I actually saw in Italy. So I was wondering if something similar happened there. Also, I guess fascist era was different from now, but it's also in relation to what you just said and what was mentioned on the north and the south of Italy and the relationship between them.
That is very true. So to be totally honest, I actually don't know what they were doing with market construction in southern Italy. I would not be surprised if they took a similar tact. Italy also had, during the fascist period, Italy also engaged in what they called internal colonization. So they built fascist new towns in the Pontine marshes. This is part of Mussolini's narrative of doing what Caesar and the popes could not, and forcibly removing generally far left people who disagreed with the regime and relocating them into these newly opened areas. So they have parallel construction projects that are happening around Rome, and they are, part of the nationalization is building railroads, is building post offices, anything that connects groups, and markets could fall under that. So that would be a great research project.
You mentioned that you needed, or that you are working with local archives. What do you mean by that? Where exactly are you looking, and is any of the work or the materials you're finding not Italian or Are you doing any oral histories?
Yes, I am. So I'm using, well, first let me give the kind of the broader answer to the question. And that is, I work not exclusively, but very close to exclusively with small regional archives. And that is because the major government archives generally don't have voices that I want to hear. It's usually government sources because they have the funding behind it. And this is something that makes, this is part of the reason why food is so useful in recovering the voices of people who are not able to keep textual histories. The small regional archives were more likely to hold the ephemera of people who were considered small and regional. So if you want a subaltern history, it's typically in, and what I've been using are food companies' archives, because they had the money, and they had the will, they had the motive to keep all of these records. You can get a really rich blend of first-hand accounts, you can get financial records, you can get memos, and I also use a lot of workers' archives. Similar to the United States in the 60s, there was a burst of interest in workers' rights. And in Italy, that took the form of recording people's histories. A lot of people recorded them and then never did anything with them. So there are a ton of, they're called the sigil archives, all over Italy, and people almost never go to them.
But you're not doing anything in Ethiopia.
There is actually an archive that is digitizing their sources in Eritrea, which has an amazing trove of, it's based in Asmara, and they have an incredible trove of radio interviews that were done in the 60s. They wanted to know about everyday life under fascist rule from the average person, which was incredibly progressive at the time. Almost nobody was making those recordings. So they conducted interviews actually with a lot of former domestic workers and with just people from all different walks of life. So I'm still going through those because they're in a mix of, they're in a bunch of different languages, so it takes a while to go through them. Additionally, the Wolfsonian Archive in Miami has an amazing collection of Ethiopian and Eritrean ephemera.
Hi, thanks for an excellent talk. So I'm actually from the Iris Cantor UCLA Women's Health Center. So a little bit of kind of a medical question. So one is, and there's sort of two parts. So one is, you talked about wet nursing in a colonial context. Was wet nursing occurring in Italy during this period? And then my second question is the public health impact, if known, of the colonial wet nursing, because we know in most contexts that will then decrease the health of the wet nurses and their own children. So can you speak to that?
Yes, definitely. Let me start with the first part of your question first. Wet nursing was occurring in mainland Italy, and in fact it goes back. The earliest sources we can trace are at least to the Middle Ages. What's particularly interesting about it was a male-controlled activity. You would actually write up a contract, and there were women who were wet nurses by trade. The history is, it can be quite sad because there were some qualitative characteristics that people believed made for a great wet nurse. One of which was that you lost your own child. So you can imagine how that would impact that particular career choice. So men would write up, the husband and the two husbands would write up a contract together. How long you would breastfeed, how much, and there was a whole hierarchy of who was a good or bad wet nurse for a particular child based on what town you were from. A lot of this information is coming from the Renaissance, not the Renaissance perfected, but in any case, there's some wonderful work that's been done on the contractual nature of wet nursing in Italy. So it was definitely still going on at the time. And in terms of the public health impact, the sources are so biased that it's very difficult to say. For me, one of the hallmarks of fascism is the use of fake science. And I looked at, there's a very helpful series of medical journals that were produced and actually printed in Addis during this period. I have no medical background, but even I can tell that it's all, so.
One last thought that was inspired by your argument about foodways is that you could maybe look at the reconstitution of these chaotic markets in Italy now, because there are so many informal food markets created by immigrants everywhere in cities in Italy that is interesting to see them as a kind of return under different guise of the markets that were destroyed by fascist imperialism in East Africa.
That would be lovely. They very much are, and they're now part of postcolonial literature. I'm thinking of Rivka Sabatu's work in her collection of poems, and it's a beautiful series. It's from the Enios Macamondi Publishing House, and they are dedicated to doing bilingual books, so having Italian on one side and then having Tigrinya and the Geet script system on the other. And in the back of her book, she includes a yellow page, a set of yellow pages, which lists all of the different markets. And so she gives the same weight to both her poetry and to finding markets in Rome where you can purchase Eritrean and secondarily Ethiopian ingredients.
Right, but there are also just informal street markets, like for example, the train station in Quórum. It's unbelievable. You can find all kinds of African food that's sold, informally in clusters of people there sitting on the floor.
The foodways are, it's fascinating because you can see how foodways changed with the Italian colonial influence, and then I think we'll start to see some interesting ways that foods from the Horn of Africa will be influencing Roman cuisine and Turinese cuisine.
I can't resist the opportunity to ask a very brief question. And so, full disclosure, I'm an anthropologist. The anthropological and the erotic. I couldn't let that go because part of, in the US, the anthropological and the erotic are totally tied together, right? It's the pornographic is in part the anthropological gaze, right? And that history is incredibly problematic. And I worked once in an archive that housed a lot of works being published in the same time as you're writing about, and actually in the 30s. And in the US, there was this amazing overlap between sort of pornographic publishing and the ethnographic. And you would get people actually putting sexy covers on Margaret Mead and Bronislaw Malinowski books on the one hand, and on the other hand trying to make sound really scientific books that when you open them are clearly pornography. And so I'm just curious, in your own analysis relative to this moment in history in Italy, where the anthropological begins and where the erotic ends.
They're almost impossible to tell apart. It's, again, the strange thing is that you can't tell in the document itself because the users of the document are flipping back and forth between saying this is anthropological versus this is erotic. So I think they're actually exploiting that very ambiguity that rests between the two.
Well, please join me in thanking Diana.